Front-end architecture pitfalls and startups, lessons from experience. Written by, I'm going to butcher this, Iaroslav Sobolev. I butchered that. I apologize, but my professional experience was definitely in the startup world, and for 3 different positions, I focused mainly on front-end. A little bit of back-end on the last position, but I want to see what he has to say, so let's dive into it. Several times, I was among the first developers and front-end leads in various startups. Some have grown into mature companies with hundreds of developers, but unfortunately, most did not survive the growth stage. Architectural design mistakes made in the early stages significantly contributed to the failure of these startups. For the team, these mistakes resulted in stress over time and an inability to develop the product effectively. For the company, it meant losing precious time, users, money, or even closure. Let's look at what these mistakes are and how to avoid them. Startup company is designed to grow fast. Every startup goes through several stages to get from an idea to a product with millions of users. The first one is the development of an MVP to validate the business idea. The next stage is to find the product market fit by testing different product hypotheses. If all goes well, there is the growth stage, when you deal with an expanding user base, growing team, and product complexity. Each of these stages requires very different approaches and architectural decisions. Let's focus more on the first 2 stages using web app development as an example. Mistakes made in these stages are the most expensive. Okay, so far I agree. Minimum viable product. Initially, a startup has a small team, little time and no clear vision of the product and target audience. To test the business idea, we usually build an MVP. Before you even get to coding, you have to make more architectural decisions. You need to decide on the high-level design, choose the components of the tech stack, and much more. Architectural pitfalls to avoid at this stage. Enterprise solution. In mature companies, analysis and POs typically contribute to product development before implementation begins. Hence, the product has a clear roadmap and a budget, and sometimes for a couple of years in advance, and developers have an opportunity to implement a complex but reliable and scalable architecture. In a startup, when the requirements are unclear, if you decide to start the development from a complex architecture, you risk finding out in a couple months that it does not fit the change requirements. Very true. Example, you set up your front-end application with micro front-ends and a mono repo. You create a dozen microservices with GraphQL API in the backend from day one. You spend a month setting up the project. Past experience. It is typical when team members' experience and personal preferences limit architectural decisions. You are familiar with the architecture of a project you worked on in the past, so you decided to apply the same approaches to the new project. As a result, you may end up with a rather complex architectural solution without considering the specifics and requirements of a new project. And this probably is a little bit more true among more junior developers. I would even argue, like even among senior developers, you probably want a variety of implementations, maybe not working at the same company or working on at least different projects with different architecture, like bringing in senior developers to be able to provide that variety of implementations will kind of prevent people from just leaning hard on what they're comfortable with. So I think hiring more senior developers with a variety of project experience and kind of staying away from more junior experience would be really helpful. At least in who is leading this project, of course. So, in your previous project, you developed a social network. In your new project, you decide to build an e-commerce marketplace on the same stack. Soon, you discovered that the SEO is essential for marketplaces, which was not considered necessary in your previous project. I am skipping the song that I'm listening to. To play around, you've long wanted to try technology that fits your startup well. Unlike big companies, you cannot afford to devote a few months to researching and adapting this technology. Svelte is a very cool framework with a fast-growing and delighted community, but let's say you have no experience with it. If you decide to build an MVP on it, you must spend significant time rediscovering solutions to typical tasks, data fetching, state management, working with styles. Do you have time for that when building an MVP in a startup? So what you're saying is to lean on your previous implementation or your previous framework. let's see. Better approach. There are 3 criteria to guide your choice of technology stack and architectural decisions when developing an app. So before I read the rest, if you're saying that you should probably lean on what you're comfortable with, I would agree. Like most frameworks, most stacks, I wouldn't say most. There are several stacks and frameworks that are going to be very marketable and popular that most of your developers that you hire are going to have experience with that you could probably use to build this MVP. I don't think you need to necessarily choose the best framework and libraries for the best framework and architecture for the very specific app that you're trying to build that you have no confidence in, that you have no idea if the market is going to give a shit about. I would argue, I don't know if this is what you're arguing, but I would argue that you probably should lean on kind of a stack and a framework that you're very comfortable with, that you could spit this app out as quickly as possible. So is that what you're going to say? So implementation speed, compliance with current requirements, ease and time effort of replacement when needed. All other things being equal, you should prefer the simplest solution or option or solution, even if it seems suboptimal, and more complex architecture should be achieved through an evolutionary process. If you choose from several options, next remix beat, is it worth checking whether each option meets your current requirements? It is worth checking. Okay, yes, I agree. You can hardly guess how the product will develop in 6 months or a year, so accounting for all the possible scenarios in the app architecture is counterproductive. Okay, I agree with this. So the MVP, like solidifying the MVP and the requirements initially is incredibly important. Make sure whatever you're using does meet those requirements. But I would argue like implementation speed is... Okay. I would argue this is number one, compliance with current requirements. Like if you have a major blocker and have to switch frameworks, like that's huge. But I feel like having kind of a senior developer that has used a variety of frameworks in this situation to be able to kind of filter that is going to be really helpful. This is why I think startups that hire junior developers are just setting themselves up to fail when you don't have good leadership on the team. And that's the tricky thing. Sometimes startups don't have a lot of funding and you're paying people less and you're going to attract people with a lesser skill level. And that's a really rough thing for startups, but it hurts startups. If you're going for funding and you are going to actually bring on a software engineer on your team, keep in mind, like a lot of startup people could just, use a low-code solution. I think it's a horrible mistake to be able to create something out of AI and that's going to become some tangled mess. It doesn't scale and creates a bunch of bugs and that, a non-tech person isn't going to be able to navigate through those waters. But using a low-code solution to be able to build a prototype and put that app out in front of people might be what startups or founders need to do if they can't hire a good senior software engineer to prep this. Yeah. So you are choosing between, I need a mark where I leave off. You are choosing between Next.js and a simple single page application based on Vite. If now among the requirements of your product, there's no need for good indexability by search engines, you should not seriously consider this criterion when choosing a framework. There's no good need for search engines. Okay, that's fair, but I feel like, are you just doing paid advertising? Like organic search through like even blog articles or... I feel like almost every single startup should consider good SEO from the beginning. And so being able to like render something server side is probably a requirement for most startups, but that doesn't mean that their tool can't be hosted, or it doesn't mean that their tool has to be hosted like in the same mono repo with the same setup as their website, right? You could split those. And if you are gaining or trying to gain organic traffic through kind of a blog or kind of other content on your website out, and you're not really pushing a lot of paid ads, you're not like leaning on content creation being that advertisement, I think you can toss SEO if you are building a tool that does not need to be very searchable. I would argue, I think most startups probably just need to lean on something that's going to make it easy to be able to, like if it's a website, it just needs to render server side. Like you can condense it, you can optimize it enough for it still to be fast enough to load everything on the server and push that out. There are ways to optimize that, but I think this was just a bad example that I'm just getting stuck on. Because with V, I mean, you can implement server-side rendering, but you should always expect to have to implement that at some point in your app. I think I'm getting stuck on it just because of this specific example. You may doubt which state manager to use for your React application. And again, stop this. I mean, just stop. Like, just use React. Like, 99% of applications can just lean on React state. It's completely fine. I would argue, like, pulling in something like Redux, even if you're comfortable with it, it's just too heavy. Toss it. Product market fit. After the MVP is released, you may discover its features do not meet real users' needs. Your team will have to test different hypotheses to build a product that users will really need. At this stage, the product usually does not have a clear roadmap, requirements change frequently, and architectural decisions made at the beginning are no longer fit. The code has to be constantly rewritten, and entire features have to be discarded. Okay. To try to implement a complex feature all at once, let's say you are developing a social video sharing platform. You decided to add a web-based video editor with tons of features, subtitles, crossfade, transitions, watermarks, and so on. You should not try to implement such an editor in its entirety. You should first implement only the basic functionality, trimming the video, and add the rest later, confirming that the users like the video. Do startups do this? I feel like this is really obvious. I don't think Product probably does this. I know product managers who will implement too much because they kind of are obsessed with the vision of the product that they want pushed out. But I would argue that's far and few between. I think good product managers don't do this. I think good project managers know better than this, but do CEOs and founders know this? Are CEOs and founders of really small startups able to detach themselves from their perfect vision of this feature? Maybe not. Maybe this is a good reminder for them. As developers, we know how long this takes. We have the feeling of how long this takes, and we can add to, and like sometimes as a developer at a startup, you need to voice your opinion. Just keep that in mind. All right, so reinvent the wheel. It may seem like a good idea to develop your own library of UI components. No, none of this seems like a good idea. Do developers think this is a good idea? Like, I feel like maybe startups need to be a little bit more skeptical about hiring like enterprise developers or developers that work on a team of like 1,000 plus, or like a company of 1,000 plus people. Because I have interviewed at companies where the company was actually flushing out people out of the company that took way too long to push out features because they were stuck with like really focusing on more scalable architecture, which would double, triple the time that it would take to be able to build this application. And I remember in one of my recent interviews where they were trying to flush those developers out that were kind of getting stuck on and hung up on stuff that just significantly delayed feature development, which they just wanted feedback right away, right? And I think as a developer, you have to understand what kind of company you're working for. But sometimes developers do get stuck in this mindset of just like doing it the way that they learned, and like they just have their own paradigm, that their way of building applications, their way of thinking about building applications and organizing them, that they just can't detach from. And I think that makes a really bad developer. But this is a real thing. And a lot of those developers, when funds are kind of tight, they get laid off. So this is a good lesson. You'll quickly discover that making them flexible and accessible is a time-consuming task. You'll also complicate the learning curve for new team members. They'll have to learn your components API. This is very true. But it's not that they have to learn your components API, because they're going to have to learn whatever component they're using their API, right? Like, even if you wanted to bring in abstractions, if you wanted to bring in libraries and not build your own, which is like what most startups should do, you still got to learn their API. But I think the time-consuming part is that you are building this out, which, you know, if you're trying to make it, if you're trying to create like a really good developer experience and not create a bunch of technical debt because you I feel like you're going to get this, not itch, but you're going to get these questions of like, should I structure like even the way that we take this data a certain way to account for like if we need other features built in the future? Like, those are going to be considerations, but like, why? And when you make those considerations to account for anything that might come in the future, it's going to be more time consuming. But why not just bring in a library that's like thoroughly tested and well used? Just bring in libraries that do what you're trying to do. And maybe it doesn't do it perfectly, and maybe that's a talk with the product manager, right? Or the CEO, to kind of refine the feature. Because like, if the goal is just to get this feature out and get feedback, sometimes you just have to adopt the limitations of what a library has to, what a library has. Because the main goal is to get it out in front of people. Better approach. Features in startup are a test of hypotheses. Means that you should always start with the most straightforward implementation in terms of app functionality and code structure. More advanced engineering practices should be postponed until you verify that the users need the feature. It's not worth wasting time in your own state manager, component library, calendar, drag and drop, caching system, and other typical tasks for which there are proven solutions or libraries. Okay, yes, we agree. In addition, it is worth mentioning backend as a service, API as a service, examples like OAuth, Algolia, Contentful, Twilio, Stripe. These services provide ready modules for implementing various functionalities in an application. On the one hand, they allow developers to speed up development and reduce infrastructure support costs significantly. Yes, 100%. You should be leaning on something like that. On the other hand, as your product grows, the cost of these services may increase so much that it will be cheaper to implement them later. Simple solution. Developer experience. Time spent on setting up development tools pays off very quickly. Make sure that at least a minimum amount of the following practices are used in the project from the beginning. CI/CD. You don't want to have to make a repeatable infrastructure with Terraform, Ansible right away, but it's at least worth setting up on GitHub Actions. Setting up GitHub Actions or GitLab CI. That's fine. I think, GitHub Actions are fairly standard. I don't know if they're standard, but like, it doesn't take long to set them up and to be able to kind of just set up a simple pipeline to not push shitty code out to production. I think that's worth it. That's fair. Static code analysis, ESLint, TypeScript, prettier. In startups, there's rarely time to write tests, but at the very least, you can set up static code analysis to catch the most basic errors. This is very true. Error monitoring, Sentry, Datadog will allow you to learn about errors simultaneously as your users and not from their complaints. Please try to write a README in which you explain how to run the project and what dependencies and environment variables it has. Yeah, all this is fine. Simple to set up. Well, I mean, like, it'll take a little bit of time, but this is like bare bones stuff. It is time to refactor. At the beginning of the project, you had to sacrifice the quality of the architecture in favor of development speed. Okay, so we're on stage 2 or whatever. This approach is good for MVP development, but unsuitable for a company at the growth stage. Sooner or later, you have to implement better engineering practices and architectural approaches to replace the ones adopted at the beginning. How do we realize that this day has come? I can just see developers that work on really large applications just like seething at this article. Like, this is the startup world, and most startups are going to fail. And there's no point in spending so much time trying to flush out a feature that where you're just trying to reduce technical debt down the road, when a lot of times that feature isn't even going to be relevant. The startup's going to pivot. A lot of startups pivot to even succeed, and most startups just fail in general. So like, I can see a lot of developers having a really hard time adjusting. And I think, so I came from like, let's just push out shit quickly and test it, flush it out. And then we'll focus on kind of creating more, like, our own custom reusable components. And then we'll focus on like organizing the code. But I would argue I was in like mid-stage startups where architecture and testing was still prioritized to an extent. Organization, consistent conventions, stuff like that. So I would argue that I've seen a lot of new startups. So like, there are enterprise developers. There are developers that are used to doing things in an extremely structured way, and they cannot pivot from that because they don't know any other way. But I would argue I've seen new startups create applications that are just horrible to maintain. No, like, you don't even have consistent conventions. And I would argue at some point, if you just have, like, if you have multiple developers on a team, you probably should talk with each other and agree on conventions. You should be doing code reviews with each other, because I've seen code pushed out where people don't even look at the code reviews, right? They're just trying to get features out the door. And man, does that create a shitstorm very quickly. So I would argue there are some startup cultures or some dev teams in startups who need to just talk with some other developers who are a little bit more used to kind of rigid guidelines or just conventions and rules that they set for each other on the team, where just things they agree with. I think your developers should agree on certain conventions. There are extremes where you're not pushing out features enough, you're too rigid, and where you are just creating a tangled mess that is going to catch up to you quickly. I think there's a balance to be met, but I think at the very least, like, you got to agree on certain conventions, and what those conventions are, you need to talk about. But this is where it helps to have a senior developer on the team who has gone through, has experienced a lot of technical debt that has creeped up in startups, that has created arguments in just features not getting pushed out and teams getting deadlocked, right? You need senior developers that have seen this and know what to at least create in terms of like rules and rigidity in how your team develops features, like the bare minimum. You need a senior developer that has been through this crap. Because I've heard horror stories of startups where their team just gets deadlocked in just how to implement something. And this happens a lot on the front end, a lot more on the front end than the back end, I think. Okay, where the hell were we? So at the beginning, we had to sacrifice the quality of the architecture in favor of development speed. This approach is good for MVP. Sooner or later, you have to implement better engineering practices. Yep. How do we realize that this day has come? The signals to watch out for: it has become harder to add new features. True. Yep. Architecture no longer meets your development needs. Your application has more bugs and performance issues sometimes. And this happened. Like, the problem with this message of this article is this happens very quickly. And I think some of this is avoidable by, again, having a senior developer that can consider some basic architectural patterns that, like, you probably should adopt, that isn't going to have developers tearing their hair out 6 months later trying to manage this app. Sometimes you have to say no to your PO. You started to miss estimates and deadlines. This is another thing that a lot of developers have trouble with. And you have to fight against. I wonder if like the startup world or kind of enterprise world where like you have more autonomy to like push back on this kind of stuff. Because in a startup world, I feel like you have more product ownership as a developer. In enterprise world, maybe you don't. I'd feel much more comfortable pushing back on this in a startup world. Anytime you see these signals, it's worth investing the problem, planning the refactoring, revisiting the decisions you made earlier. Conclusion. In a startup, navigating architectural designs can be challenging, but there are some principles to follow that increase your chances of success. Use tools and architectural approaches that solve the current problem. Start simple, gradually become more complex as needed. Take the time to customize a project for you or your and others' convenience. Set up CI/CD. Like, what do you mean? Every time I hear this, or every time I know other developers hear this, any backend developers, any DevOps, something that's implemented often is complex, and the domain knowledge of that is locked to that single developer because they made it so complex. Like I've heard about stories and I've seen code where if that developer had left the company in a startup, like we're kind of screwed. Thankfully, I had some pretty good CTOs who could have like probably figured some of this out, but like this is time consuming. I would say like, I would argue that like just leaning on Git actions and rules to be able to block certain things and just make sure like actual code reviews are being done is really important. I don't think you need to like spin up some testing server or anything like that. You can manually test, you can pull the code and test on your machine. But that's another thing. There are code reviews in startups that are just approved without testing on the machine, like even like really complex features. You should be downloading that code locally. At the very least, like spin up a testing server. Maybe a testing server does make sense. But you, at the very least, you should be downloading code locally and testing this feature out. Especially when you don't know what developers care to do their own Q&A. Because in a startup, you might not have Q&A. Developers are doing Q&A. And a lot of developers don't do their own Q&A. They should, but especially if you come from a bigger company, I mean, they lean pretty heavily on QA catching kind of like a lot of these oddball issues and having knowledge across the entire application to be able to like know if this feature is going to break something else in the application. Like as developers, we see the code base, we can kind of know, but sometimes we don't. And I think having knowledge of the entire application, how it works, what it's supposed to do, at least in the areas around the feature that you're building, like that's important. And not enough developers care about that sort of thing. So I would argue like developers should be very product oriented in a really early stage startup. They should know what's happening. They should know what the product does. Especially if you're just starting with a startup, like you should know almost everything about that product. Especially if it's just like a developer or two on the team. I can argue, like for mid-stage, do you need to know the entire application? Eventually, I think it is helpful because you might be swapping, you might be supplementing, like some developer might be out of town. You being that developer that can pick up what any bugs that come up or anything like that, that's awesome. It's just going to look good for you. It helps the team out. So I'm actually leaning more on like a good CI/CD pipeline from the beginning, but I don't think you need to build something that is really scalable in the beginning. I think just something that guards for good code quality is important, but not necessarily something that's scaling to 10,000 users when your application isn't even launched yet. Error reporting, I think, is pretty important. I would even argue that I think error reporting should probably come later. I don't know if you need to launch that in the very beginning when you are launching a brand new application. I don't even think that's worth it. Static code analysis, I think, could be really helpful. Yep. Add a README to make it easier for new developers. Yep. Startup environment is inherently volatile. Adapt quickly to the changes. Startup world is tricky. It's really difficult. You have to be product oriented. You have to care about the product. Like, you don't have to. It's much easier if you care about the product, if you care about the company. Like, you are probably sacrificing salary a bit. Maybe you're even accepting a bit of equity. Like, if we're talking about early stage startups, you got to believe in what you're doing, what you're building. But I love the startup world, and I think I am probably going to stick with the startup world. I like building out applications. I like pushing it out, getting user feedback, thinking about marketing, thinking about the product, owning that product. Like, I am that type of developer. And I feel like if you are the type of developer that wants to, like, I guess, be creative, if you're a developer that wants to just design the perfect architecture and that's like your creative outlet, I don't think the startup world is for you. I just don't. It requires a different way of thinking. And some people just aren't meant for the startup world, to be honest. It's just not for them. For me, I love it. I agree with most of this article. So, yeah, I will link this in the description below, but I'd love to hear what you thought. Let me know in the comments below.